Welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. I'm Barr. I'm your host for this week's show. Well, today we're going to talk a little bit about online newspapers and how we can stop political violence, and that all starts right after this.
Welcome to the fast-paced and unrehearsed weekly discussion featuring the leaders who help shape your world. Join us as we address the issues that impact you each and every day. This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers. And now, here's your host.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. My first guest today is Terry Tracy. Terry is the publisher and CEO of, did I get that one right?
You got that one right.
Perfect. Of Broad and Liberty, which is a relatively new online newspaper. I want to talk a little bit about that. So what is Broad and Liberty? Did I characterize that right, online newspaper?
That's fair. Thanks for having me, Gene. I appreciate it. So Broad and Liberty was founded in 2019, so relatively new, as an online outlet for policy entrepreneurs and thought leaders within the sort of broader conservative movement, classical liberals, what have you, that otherwise felt like they were not getting a fair shake in sort of establishment newspapers. And but shortly after its founding, pivoted strongly into investigative journalism. Broad and Liberty now is one of the flagship properties of the recently created Federi News Network that has more than almost 25 digital properties at this point, providing community news, sports news, political and policy news throughout eastern Pennsylvania and southern New Jersey.
Okay, so it's still kind of a regional Federi is then through eastern PA?
It is. I would say that, you know, we're primarily anchored, we're deeply embedded in the metropolitan Philadelphia area, in particular in the collar counties. But we've recently expanded into Lancaster, into the Harrisburg area, and all along the Jersey shoreline. So we now have online newspapers running from Atlantic City to Cape May, which obviously has a strong connection with a lot of folks back in the Philly area. And in 26, we'll be expanding into the Lehigh Valley. So we're making our way across the Commonwealth with, you know, I think relatively good speed.
Let me go back to something you said. So is it fair to state that this was published, actually you guys started your endeavor as a reaction to a view that, hey, we're not quite getting a fair shake from the more traditional print side?
Well, yes, but it's more than that. I had for some time believed that the policy debate in the metropolitan Philadelphia area sort of lacked, conservatives seeded the playing field from an intellectual perspective, right? And I think this is true in big cities, big metropolitan areas across the Commonwealth. As they became politically more difficult, you saw folks from the right of center stop to engage at sort of the local policy level because it just wasn't politically palatable. But I believed that the intellectual capital was necessary in order for any kind of political resurgence to ultimately exist. So that was the premise at the time, but it became much more than that, Gene. It really became, you know, the ideological disposition of the editorial pages notwithstanding, the news is really a very different product. And fundamentally, what we believed was that the people were not getting the information they needed at the state and local level to make informed decisions about who ought to be running the show or which policies had the biggest and best impact on their quality of life. And this is not just a function of ideology, right? This is also a function of the economics of news and the fact that the county dailies and the big metropolitan papers that for years serviced these regions and provided that information no longer could do so. And so while the economics of the business are certainly challenging, no one would debate that, there's been so much change, I believe it created an opportunity for others to sort of disrupt that model that had been the same for decades and still provide that service to the public, which I ultimately believe is a civic imperative and a public good.
Yeah, and as you note, it's been real, as we all know, tough times for the traditional print industry. So it had to be a little bit of a leap for you guys to go, well, we can make this, we can do this online, and we can make it work? Or was it like, man, this is really going to be dicey?
It's dicey, but any startup is dicey in any industry, right? And any industry that's going through a tremendous amount of structural change or macroeconomic pressure, you're taking some level of risk, right? But the risk is not without the reward if I think A, you believe in the mission, and two, fundamentally, it's about the product. It's a consumer good. People are consuming information at a higher rate than they ever were. They have access to information, more information than they ever did.
Okay.
So to me, that presented an opportunity to build a sustainable business model, but that model was going to have to look and feel very different than what had existed for decades prior.
Let's come back and talk a little bit about that. We're going to go away here for a couple of messages, and we'll be right back.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business, and by the Pennsylvania State Education Association, bringing the power of a great education to our schools, our students, and our communities. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Please visit pahighwayinfo.org. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. We're here with Terry Tracy. Terry's a publisher and CEO of Broad and Liberty. So let's go back and talk a little bit about, it's interesting. I love the term you use, policy entrepreneurs, for a kind of a interesting class of folks. And again, as you admit, it's to the right of center. Now, how many, I know that your model uses a lot of guest columnists, and some of them aren't all from right of center.
Absolutely.
There's a range there. So how many full-time employees as reporters do you have? You noted that you've moved into more investigative journalism, but tell me a little bit about your model. What's your staffing look like?
Yeah, so ideological diversity on the pages is really important. The organization's disposition does not necessarily influence those of our writers, but certainly it is a home for what I would call a broad coalition of folks that diverge from what you might see in your standard metropolitan newspapers' editorial pages. But that being said, the new network actually has substantial reach. So we have 14 full-time reporters.
Okay.
We have another 6 or 7 senior editors. We have another 12 freelance contributors that augment the reporters' work. And we have sort of our flagship investigative reporter teams. And again, they cover everything from community news that has nothing to do with politics to doing a deep dive into the state budget or what's going on in the state capitol. And we have a pretty substantial sports operation focused on high school, college, and professional sports in Philadelphia as well. So, and in addition to that core staff, over the course of any given year, we could have another 50 to 75 independent contributors or guests on podcasts and things of that nature.
And it's interesting, you note the coverage, your sports coverage, which is relatively new, and you've branched out into that to make it more,
Somebody I know
arts and
gave
culture.
me a good tip that maybe
some
this
arts
I
and
to
culture. some arts and culture, you're probably doing some of
Absolutely.
that. And I think that when you look back historically what the local papers have done, covering those local sports and covering school board races, local elected races in more detail was always one of the hallmarks of them. And they've admitted that we just don't have the ability, we don't have the folks who can go out and do this anymore. But you guys did that. You did a lot of coverage of some of the interesting policy dynamics that were going on, particularly in some of the school board races over the last couple of years, right?
It's all about meeting people where they're at. And I recognize the structural challenges that the big newspapers have. And so, we're building a model that allows us to cover that and produce content that shows up in people's feeds and on their phones and what have you. So it's accessible and dynamic. But, on the more substantive aspects of it, you're right. I have long believed that those are the races that matter the most. The school board, the county commissioner, the city council, because they make the decisions that have the biggest impact on people's lives. And I think a point that has been lost over the course of the last 5 years is how much the policy landscape at that level has changed, primarily because of the actions taken by the federal government during the COVID pandemic. They flooded these county and local governments and school boards with tens of millions of dollars at a hyper-local level, billions across the country, right? And both Trump's CARES Act, which was a little bit more explicit with respect to dealing with the impact of the pandemic, but President Biden's ARPA Act was really something immediately adjacent to a blank check. And so one of the things we watched was how are these local governments using those funds. And one of the things that has been particularly unsettling for us, and we are a taxpayer-oriented organization editorially, is so much of this money has been used to build new bureaucracy at the local level, or otherwise has been obligated to fixed costs that when that one-time funding runs out,
you have a problem.
And look at Delaware County.
Which is actually what we saw in 08 too.
Yes, and this is that situation on steroids. In Delaware County has raised taxes by 55% in 3 years. Chester County, 14% last year. Montgomery County has almost doubled their residential real estate tax revenue. This is not sustainable. Yeah. And so this is the kind of work that we're focused on.
So you guys will keep following that one.
Give people the information they need. Yeah.
So what's been, in just literally 20 seconds, what's been the reaction from the traditional media to your startup? And it's no longer a startup, it's been around a while.
Not to pump our own tires, but this year we were recognized by the Pennsylvania Newsmakers Association for best in investigative journalism.
Oh, okay.
We work closely with that organization and have got to know our peer set. Yeah, certainly we're the new kids on the block, but
good.
They've let us in the treehouse, and we're happy to play.
So things are working. Things are working. Terry, thanks for being on. Let's hope to have you on again in the future. Anyway, when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about how we can all address this issue of political violence and talk a little more civilly, and we'll do that right when we come back.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Cross-State Credit Union Association. Credit unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, visit crossstate.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Association of Pennsylvania State College and University Faculties, representing the faculty and coaches who are devoted to providing quality public higher education for Pennsylvania's college students.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Our next guest is Will Fuller. Will is the Pennsylvania State Lead for the Resilient States Project, which is an effort of Common Ground USA. Did I get all that right? I just want to make sure. There's a lot in there. Perfect. Okay, good. So first, let's talk a little bit about what is Common Ground USA. I know it's a national as well as, in many cases, an international organization, right?
That's right. So Common Ground USA is a national organization, and really what we do is to try to transform the way that our country deals with conflict. We know that conflict's inevitable. We live in a society where people often disagree and have the right to disagree about many issues that we see today. But our experience globally and domestically, I think, shows us that that doesn't have to devolve into violence, that actually those points of disagreement can be the place where we find the things we value the most and can be the opportunities for the greatest collaboration. And that's what our programs seek to do.
Okay. So what is the Resilient States Project? I believe it started at 23. Does that sound right?
That's
okay.
Right.
Tell us about what that is. I know PA is one of only a handful of states in which you guys are particularly focusing on this.
That's right. Yeah, this project also exists in Texas as well, in Ohio and Arizona. Really what we're after with the Resilient States Project, we started with the question, who is it that people trust in polarized times? We know that there's a lot of tension, that rhetoric is toxic at large right now in our country, but at the local level, oftentimes we find there's still that trust of leadership to do the right thing when it counts. So we try to engage local leaders, whether they're from the business community, veterans, faith leaders, educators, and more, the people whom people trust, to build that collaborative spirit and that problem-solving attitude together through resources, trainings, and eventually bringing them together around acts and instances of political violence to try to respond.
Okay, and I know at that time the whole end game, or at least on the trail to the end game, was to prevent violence ahead of the 2024 elections when we saw what happened in 2020, et cetera. How successful would you say you were at doing some of that?
Well, by and large, the 2024 election went off without major incident. And I think that is something that we often pass over when we talk about the implications of the election one way or the other, that it had the potential to be far more volatile than it was. So in that regard, I think we can all, be grateful for that. I think what we see now is that those tensions that were existing there still remain, and in many ways they've only grown. And so even though we feel good about, how we navigated that particular cycle, we know that oftentimes elections are really a test of resilience for communities to show us where we're strong and where we're weak in terms of relationships and ability to withstand this stuff.
So we throw around the term political violence a lot. We hear it today in the media quite a bit. How would you define political violence?
We define political violence essentially as any act that limits participation in public life. Oftentimes when people think of that term, they tend to associate it with, physical acts such as assassinations or, violence. But really, it's also that threat and harassment, the climate of intimidation that leads to chilling effect.
Okay.
So what we measure is participation in public life in local communities. Is it growing or is it shrinking? Are people volunteering more? Are they showing up as poll workers? Are they participating in community events? And really anything that goes against the grain of that and seeks to diminish that, we would include in that definition.
So it could be verbal,
Absolutely.
could be written harassment, could be any of those. You guys count that as political violence.
Yeah, what counts is the felt threat, right? I mean, for
and
local
the end result
officials.
of that
Absolutely.
action. Okay, good. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to cut away here for a moment. We'll come back and talk a little bit more with Will Fuller about this whole issue. We'll be back.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Medical Society. Inspired physicians committed to the good health of Pennsylvanians and the advancement of the practice of medicine. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania American Water. We keep life flowing across the Keystone State.
Welcome back to Pennsylvania Newsmakers. We're here with Will Fuller from the Resilient States Project of Common Ground. We're going to put up some information on screen here that'll show you how to get more information about this effort. We're going to put that up here. And I'm going to take a look at that. And I'm sure they'd love to hear from you and to gather that. So, how prevalent is, and it seems like it's getting more prevalent, or maybe there's just more coverage of the violence that's out there. We've seen it directed, and look, let's be honest, it's coming from the right and the left. This is not particular to either one, right?
That's right. It's interesting to note that that several of these high-profile incidents, when you look at motives of the people perpetrating them, they're often hard to discern. They're very nihilistic in intent, and so the climate that's out there is a really difficult one. The thing we try to remind people in this is that, in fact, statistics show across the board, no matter where you look at it, the overwhelming majority of Americans do not condone violence in any way as a way to solve our problems. The felt sense of that can be different than the reality on the ground. So a lot of our programming is aimed at trying to lift up that silent majority and show people, actually, in fact, there's a lot more folks out there that want to find a way through our problems without resorting to violence.
Yeah, and we've had here a couple times on the show Pennsylvania Secretary of State Al Schmidt, who's talked about the violence that's been directed to poll workers, who are literally the neighbors sometimes of the people who are initiating this violence.
Yeah, and that, again, back to the chilling effect that this stuff has on participation. The people that are doing that work, as you said, are volunteering. They're wanting to serve their country and serve their community. And when they experience things like that, it's a little bit harder to make that choice.
We're having trouble finding them already, and this just absolutely makes it worse. So one of the things that happened, I guess it was now 24, was a situation in Charleroi in which there was information alleged about some members of the Haitian community there. And I know your organization got involved in that. Tell us a little bit about what you did out there.
Yeah, we did. So it was really interesting. I think when we look at response to these situations, what works best is holistic, community-oriented, whole-of-society response. And that is what we saw in Charleroi. We had people from the education community. We had Haitian business leaders. We had borough council people, Chamber of Commerce. Everyone came together to say, okay, what can we do in the face of this to lift up the values that we all share? And what ended up happening was a community dinner where everybody got together. People brought dishes across different ethnic lines, or even a cookie table, which we know is like a big deal in Western PA.
That's a big Western PA
right?
thing, yeah.
And people had the chance to talk to each other about what they feared, what their hopes were for their community. And when you get in those situations to have those conversations, that's the place where collaboration can begin to thrive.
Okay.
They came up with that. All
Yeah.
we did really was come alongside them as a thought partner to say,
Help to
here's
move
how you
them
can
into
make
that.
it better.
Yeah, that's good. And recently there was a situation here in central PA where apparently the Ku Klux Klan was handing out some literature information at a Halloween parade in Mechanicsburg, and you guys were alerted to that and tried to inject yourself into that too to try and tamp some of this down, right?
Right. What we tell folks is we're here when people need us, and we want to be a thought partner with them in coming up with things that actually work to transform and take these moments which are unfortunate and use them as a way to jump off into a positive direction. That's what happened in Mechanicsburg. I want to shout out the faith community there in particular. They really took the lead in coming up with their own sort of rally and response. They brought together a wide array of people across political difference to come together and to speak up publicly on what they cared about, what they shared. Really all we did was just, encourage them that yes, this is the right thing and this is the right moment to do that.
Provided that support to them. Yeah, good. Well, all right, we're here. We're getting ready to head into the holidays in which you've got family gatherings and dinners, and unfortunately somebody typically brings up somehow politics at the Christmas Eve or Christmas Day dinner. So you guys have some thoughts and some advice for folks in terms of all of that. What do you advise people when you're gathering people together of different political persuasions?
Yeah, so the first thing I would want to say, we have a resource on our website, the Peacemakers Toolkit. Anyone can download it, and one of the resources on there is how to have these conversations. Second, it's really difficult when we disagree to hold the humanity of the person across the room from us. Even harder when it's family, when we know their history and we've had those fights, right? But we encourage people, active listening, seeking to understand, even just taking a breath and taking a break. Those are okay things to do to come back as a healthy person, be able to engage with that person, to see them as a human being, to understand that there's so much more to the disagreement than just the words, but there's values underneath. And if we can ask questions to get at the heart of those, we can understand the motive that people have, and then we can build a different direction from there. Okay,
good. So quickly, very quickly, before we wrap this up, what do you guys have planned for 2026? Quickly.
Really just a lot of different community programs designed to sort of lower the temperature and increase civility, remind us of the better angels of our nature, right? We have a lot of different programming that we're working on at the local level. Again, we think that's where it's the most effective. So engaging local leaders and really activating civil response.
And people can find that from your from your website. Well, thanks very much for coming on, and we're all going to pay some attention to that, and hopefully it makes a big difference. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for being with us on Pennsylvania Newsmakers. Look forward to seeing you on the next show. Thanks.